5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. It's been live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, welcome to our very shrewd and very smart audience. It's a very sad time with war raging, not just between Israel and the inhabitants of Gaza and Hamas, but now between two major powers, Israel and Iran, with casualties on both sides and a real danger of a wider war that could engulf the Middle East, and who knows how far it may spread after that. It's a very sobering and sober moment for everyone in America and everyone in the world. You know, I just lament the human condition that seems prone time and time and time again to try to futilely settle differences and disputes with violence, death, and destruction, which almost never solves anything except leading to more violence, death, and destruction. You know, supposedly World War I was the war to end all wars, right? And we've been in a constant state of war ever since the end of World War I, including the most devastating war in history, World War II, that claimed likely well over 60 million lives. And Sam, in these wars, is it the soldiers who suffer the most casualties?
Usually civilians.
It's
right?
usually civilians. It's innocent persons who have no part, who are killed, wounded, displaced.
Yeah, I'm starting to get sick of this line. I hear a lot of people using it since October 7th, and now it's like, well, that's just what it is with war. People die. It's like, can't we live in a society where we don't just throw up our hands when innocent people are killed because two governments are fighting? Why are we accepting this? We should be trying to change the world so that this is not a norm and that we don't just throw up our hands and just say, in wars, people die. It's like,
yeah,
let's stop having wars. Let's stop having civilian casualties during these wars. It's absurd.
It really is. And, you know, that was one of my critiques, not just of this military parade, which was one of the biggest flops,
I know,
you know,
boring,
in modern
right?
history.
It was so weird. It was just so
listless,
such a
and
dud.
lifeless.
You know, you thought when Trump was getting this parade ready,
Yeah.
you're like, oh, he's really going to go all out, which was going to be sort of, I don't know, at least
celebratory,
yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people.
They were just like tanks, kind of like old tanks squeaking through the streets.
Right, and nobody in the stands.
And troops sort of just listlessly walking through the street. It was
and
quite
rumors that Trump was falling asleep.
Yeah, he looked bored. They kept
he certainly, I don't know if he was falling asleep, but he was certainly closing his eyes and nodding.
Yeah, strange.
And then, you know, a very un-Trump-like, dispiriting kind of speech. You know, I've said it half facetiously, but actually fairly seriously, that instead of celebrating death and destruction with, you know, these tanks and cannons and I guess now automated dogs, you know, that carry some kind of weapons, we should be celebrating life. We should have teachers with blue books and pencils, right? Doctors and nurses with stethoscopes marching. You know, why don't we celebrate life rather than celebrate death and destruction? And in no way am I denigrating the brave men and women who risk their lives by going into service. That's not the point. The point is, as you point out, Sam, and as you noted, these horribly destructive wars have the most devastating effects on civilians and almost never solve anything. You know, we've been in a perpetual state of war throughout most of human history. And, you know, one war just begets another. Violence begets violence.
So,
go ahead.
Well, were you going to add one last thing or not?
I was going to start talking about, bring this down to the war in the Middle East.
Yeah, my question is, why is this happening? Who's to blame? And why is it happening now? Those are my three main questions.
Oh, little tiny questions.
Well, they're important things to answer right now.
Yeah. Well, let me answer them then as best as I can. First of all, you have two very bad actors On the one hand, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu, who simply believes in death and destruction to solve problems. What he has done in Gaza is absolutely appalling and ghastly. They're not talking about, get this, Sam, 55,000 deaths in Gaza, And I'm not sure about the breakdown, but I guarantee most of them are civilians, or at least a very substantial proportion. And I'm not even talking about the displacement, the famine, the disease that's resulted from what Netanyahu has done. He has forfeited the moral high ground that Israel and the Jewish people have held for so long. And I never would have thought I'd see the day that Israel would become an international pariah because of the atrocities that it committed against another people.
Even if you take Israel's word for it, and they're really just targeting Hamas leaders, and Hamas is hiding behind civilians, even if you take that all to be true, which is up for debate, they're doing a pretty shitty job of hitting. You would think they would do a little, they would try to reduce the civilian casualty a little bit more than 55,000.
Well, that's not all civilians, but they're indiscriminately killing.
Right.
They're not letting aid come in. People are starving. People are getting sick. They're hitting hospitals. They're hitting refugee camps.
And even if Hamas is hiding in these hospitals, Israel, you need to do a better job at hitting the Hamas leaders that are under these hospitals than just bombing the hospitals and killing, a couple hundred civilians a pop every time you do it.
Yeah, I mean, the history of this war is not going to be a very positive one for anyone, not for Hamas. I am not a Hamas supporter.
No, I am not. Hamas is
not.
Worse than Netanyahu, or just as bad, whatever you want to say.
Yeah. As I said, this will not be written positively for anyone, not for Hamas, and sadly, not for Netanyahu. And, as a Jewish person, I deeply resent Trump and his cronies equating support for Israel with support for Netanyahu.
I know, it's so annoying.
That is so awful. I have been a supporter of Israel for well over 50 years. I am not a supporter of Netanyahu. I am an American patriot. I've done as much as I could for our country, but I'm not a supporter of President Donald Trump.
Right.
That does not mean I hate my country like Donald Trump is always denigrating his critics. Just means I'm against the current leadership.
Right. Their logic in all this is about, a fifth grader's logic.
At best. I'm not even sure it would pass.
It's surprising to me that people take that kind of logic seriously, but some people do for some reason. I don't.
And of course, you got bad actors in Iran as well.
Of course.
This horrific Ayatollah Khomeini and his repressive, terroristic regime. So it's bad actors all around.
And a lot of Iranian citizens do not like the Islamic State that they live in Iran, and a lot of Israelis don't like Netanyahu.
Right. Probably, in a free and fair election prior to his, wagging the dog and going after Iran, he'd have lost. And he barely won last time.
Right.
There's tremendous dissent from Netanyahu.
Yeah, it seemed like Israel had gotten rid of him.
Yeah, they came close.
Right, and then he came.
Yeah, and he was under indictment too for corruption.
Oh my God!
The Donald Trump of Israel. It's a pretty accurate moniker.
I think he's worse than Trump. At least, Trump doesn't have thousands of bodies on his name.
Not yet. I hope he does. Well, that's another point. We'll get to him.
Okay.
Whether he will get involved in this war.
Right.
But let's go to the root of this. Donald Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear accords.
So you think that's the real cause of all this?
I think that's the root. All these other things I've mentioned are part and parcel.
Right, and I've seen people arguing that he pulled out because a lot of Israeli lobbyists and government officials pressured him to pull out.
That's certainly true,
right.
But I think there's another reason he pulled out.
Okay, go ahead.
He was against anything with Obama's name on it.
Right.
I don't care if it's the nuclear accords, the Paris Accords, the Affordable Care Act, DACA, it doesn't matter. Anything with Obama's name on it, he was against. And, his arguments against it were totally flimsy. First of all, let's understand, this treaty was not ever designed, and by the way, it took 2 years to negotiate, to turn Iran into a liberal democratic democracy, to stop its sponsorship of terrorism. That was never a part of this accord. It had one purpose and one purpose only. And what was that, Sam?
Stop proliferation.
To stop the development of a nuclear weapon. Far more important than anything else. And yes, we made concessions to Iran, including, the lifting of some significant sanctions and the unfreezing of certain funds. But guess what, Sam?
What?
You don't make a treaty unless you give up something.
Right. Isn't that the whole idea of politics and treaties and diplomacy?
Yes, it's negotiations. Of course, we had to make some concessions to Iran. Do you think they would have signed this treaty for nothing?
Right.
But again, well worth it, because the greatest danger they could possibly pose is a nuclear weapon. And then, of course, he attacked the substance of the treaty. In fact, the treaty pretty well effectively postponed any even beginning of the development of a nuclear weapon or atomic weapon by Iran for 13 to 15 years. I'm not going to go over every provision, but here are just a couple of critical ones. For 13 years, Iran agreed to eliminate its stockpile of medium-enriched uranium and to cut its stockpile of low-enriched uranium by 98%. Do you know why that's important for enriched uranium?
That's how you make weapons.
Yes,
right?
You have to have enriched uranium, and if they're eliminating it and cutting it by 98% for 13 years, they have to start all over again. Moreover, for 15 years, Iran agreed to enrich uranium only to 3.67%, well below the threshold needed for building nuclear weapons, and not to build heavy water facilities, essential and to reduce by 2/3 the number of its glass centrifuges. So there was a lot in this treaty that I said, it would be 13 to 15 years down the road from its implementation in 2016, not 2025, when they'd even be able to begin, presuming they would, when it wasn't renewed. And, the argument that it wasn't being enforced, that Iran was cheating, absolutely fabricated. The Trump administration certified this is the Trump administration, not Obama, in April 2017 and in July 2017 that Iran was complying with the nuclear accords. I'll repeat that. The Trump administration certified, shortly before Trump withdrew, that Iran was complying with the deal. Moreover, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, no flaming liberal, right, Sam?
F that guy.
Yeah. Said Mike Pompeo and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the agency tasked with verifying and monitoring Iran's compliance, said that Iran has been in compliance with the accords and there is no evidence otherwise. So, aside from getting revenge on Obama, none of the substantive arguments hold water. Treaty was not designed to transform the nature of the Iranian regime. You had to give up some concessions to get the deal. The deal was very strong over a 13 to 15 year period. And according to Trump administration officials and the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran was complying at the very time that Trump pulled out. So Trump pulls out. And what did he promise, Sam, when he pulled out?
He would give us a better deal.
Yeah, and what kind of deal did he get?
I don't think he's gotten a deal.
Zero, none.
But he always does that bullshit. He's always like, with...
I'm going to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours.
Not only that, but he always promises, this great, better deal whenever he wants to slash some existing deal.
Remember the big, beautiful health care plan that he was going to replace Obamacare with?
But I just don't understand who keeps falling for this bullshit.
I don't, and my big infrastructure day,
right,
that I'm going to have, and immediately, going to drastically reduce prices and slash the deficit.
Yeah.
So all he accomplished was solidifying extremists in Iran, who now could argue we were betrayed by the great devil, the United States, undermining any kind of opposition to the extremist Islamic government, and then removed any incentives for Iran not to develop the means to produce a nuclear weapon. It may not be imminent, but they are certainly far more advanced than they would have been. They still would have been blocked from doing anything significant under the Iran nuclear accords. So instead of enforcing non-proliferation by treaty, negotiations, concessions on both sides, 2 years of negotiations, we've now resorted to horrific violence on both sides. It is absolutely an unforced error, a preventable amount of death and destruction that should never have happened.
So how much blame do you put on Donald Trump then?
A lot.
A ton?
A ton.
I mean, obviously Netanyahu is the one sending
the immediate
bombs,
Netanyahu and
Iran
the leadership,
is
of course.
bombs back and
yeah, you heard me attack them in no uncertain terms, but the underlying problem is Donald Trump, and there's a deeper problem here.
Okay.
This is what happens when you base policy not on what's good for the American people or good for the people of the world, but on revenge and retribution.
Right.
And we're seeing exactly the same thing playing out in Donald Trump's second term. Almost everything he's doing has either been designed to help his rich friends or to wreak revenge and retribution on his enemies, even if it means destroying American leadership and scientific research, by pulling out grants from organizations, public and private, that he doesn't like. I asked you this question before. All of his policies, name one policy that reverberates in any significant way to the overall good of the American people. One, Sam.
I can't think of one.
Yeah, I can't either.
So are you saying then, we talked about earlier, I said Netanyahu has all this blood on his hands and Trump doesn't have any blood on his hands. Are you saying that this is the first time when you can actually argue that Trump might have blood on his hands? Because now innocent civilians are dying in Iran and in Israel because of him pulling out of the Iran deal?
Yes, and I also think he may have blood on his hands because of what he and RFK Jr. are doing to destroy the American public health system.
Right.
And he has already has blood on his hands.
January 6th.
Let me know, very specifically, for dismantling USAID programs to bring vital, life-saving medicines to the poorest countries of the world, particularly in Africa. And who, by the way, started the big HIV program that is credited with saving tens of millions of lives that Trump has now gutted. Was it some deranged liberal?
I think it was George W. Bush.
George W. Bush.
So this is the first time that he's got blood on his hands in terms of some sort of
warfare
or military conflict.
Right.
Well, also Syria. Didn't he do bad stuff in Syria too?
Syria is a much more complicated
So this
situation.
is the most black and white.
Yes, most black and white.
So you're saying your point is that because of the casualties and the violence that is happening right now is directly attributed to Donald Trump.
Well, indirectly attributed. It's directly attributed to
That's what I meant.
Iran and Israel, but indirectly, at root, attributable to Donald Trump. And, there have been some commentators mentioning this, but it's gotten buried. It's kind of gotten lost in the story of the war. And, it's kind of interesting. So can you hold that a sec?
Yes.
I want to see if I can find it here. I have another quote from Trump about the Middle East. After so many, and this is, again, Donald Trump making these grandiose promises that get dashed in the worst way. After so many decades of conflict, finally it is within our grasp to reach the future that generations before us could only dream about. A land of peace, safety, harmony, opportunity, innovation, and achievement right here in the Middle East. Is that astounding? Is that astonishing? Donald Trump says, if I was president, there wouldn't be any wars, right? All these wars are because of Biden or Obama. Right. Well, the Ukraine war is raging as badly as ever. The war in Gaza is raging as badly as ever. We had a war against the Houthis in Yemen, and now we have maybe the most dangerous war of all, the war of Israel and Iran, all on Trump's watch.
Whatever happened to the ceasefire? I remember when Biden was leaving, they announced this big ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, and then Biden left, and it seemed like the deal...
Because Netanyahu's guy became president. He no longer had any incentive, since there was no chance that Trump would take any action against Israel, no matter what it did.
Yeah, it seemed like the Trump administration was part of that and was proud of coming to a ceasefire, and then when they actually got into it, just sort of dissolved. It
dissolved. It's the same thing with peace in Iran. You're not going to achieve peace in Iran by appeasing Vladimir Putin and blaming Ukraine for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Again, this is like 1984 doublespeak. War is peace, famine is plenty, hate is love. That's what they're trying to implant in us. Remember, Donald Trump said, don't believe what you see or hear with your own eyes and ears. Only believe what I tell you. And you cannot achieve peace. You can only encourage aggression by appeasing Putin. And just the other day, do you remember what he said we should do in the G7 group of democratic nations?
No.
Let Russia back in.
Oh, God.
When they had been booted out because of their first invasion of Ukraine when they took over Crimea. As if, Vladimir Putin is this benevolent, wonderful, democratic partner, instead of a murderous, thuggish dictator intent upon destabilizing democracy and freedom in wherever he can find it and expanding the Soviet empire. This is a guy who said he's in love with Kim Jong-un, the guy who kills his political enemies, even family members, with anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah, that's why I remember during the election I would get so frustrated when people on the right and Trump supporters would be like, yeah, during the Trump administration, the world was at peace. He's this foreign policy genius. It's like, again, it was so obvious that was built on nothing, that nothing he did during that first term or nothing that he didn't do created any sort of world peace. In fact, he got lucky. He tried to stir things up with Iran in his first term. He tried to stir things up with North Korea in his first term.
Oh, and by the way, when he pulled out of the Iran nuclear accords, he said, not only am I going to pressure Iran into a great new deal, I'm going to pressure North Korea into a deal. And how did that work out?
Not well.
Yeah. Since then, North Korea has vastly expanded its nuclear and missile program.
Yeah, I mean, my point is, if his first couple months of foreign policy doesn't prove to you that he has no idea what he's doing, and his first term was essentially luck in terms that there was, and again, this idea that there was world peace when he was president is not even true, right?
But, yeah, and what's even more frightening is, according to today's news reports, Trump has now demanded, quote, Iran's unconditional surrender.
Right.
Trump has also said, quote, we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He is an easy target, but is safe there. We are not going to take him out, kill, at least for now. He also said, we have control over the skies over Tehran.
It's interesting that he wants Iran's unconditional surrender, but he doesn't want Russia's unconditional surrender.
Hell no.
That's a very interesting
That's a very, very interesting point.
But what does he exactly mean that he wants Iran's unconditional surrender? What does that mean exactly?
You're trying to figure out what Trump means.
Yeah.
His own lawyers said, in court, under oath. I guess they're under oath.
Does that
I'm not
mean
sure
that
lawyers are under oath? Trump never speaks with precision. You really can't take what he says at face value. His own lawyers to try. That's when he said, "Oh, we can bring back Albrego Garcia anytime we want," and the lawyers, no, don't take that seriously. He doesn't speak precisely. The understatement of the year, Trump doesn't speak precisely.
Right.
But this use of the word "we" is pretty ominous.
Why?
Because it implies we're involved. It's not Israel.
Right.
Plus, there are now stories, and again, who the hell knows with Trump, that he may be considering entering the war on Israel's side militarily, even though he has spent years criticizing the Democrats for getting us involved in these wars. We
know this. MAGA has no real ideology. They bend and flow to whatever Trump's whim is. So, yeah, I mean, yes, it's surprising and shocking in a normal situation, but these guys have no consistency in their ideology. Trump doesn't like Iran. He likes Russia. So he changes his ideology based on who he personally does and doesn't like. It's so obvious at this point.
Yeah. And here's an interesting thing when you say about things being so obvious. I mentioned this before, but I really want to emphasize it because it's very important. Trump's support is almost entirely based on people who are not paying attention to events. There is a 35-point gap, 35 points in his approval rating compared to those who are paying attention and those who are not paying attention. So a lot of it is people don't know what's going on. They're not paying attention.
Sure.
They may just, hear here and there, these bravado statements from Trump, and that's all they're getting.
Sure. I agree with that.
All right. There's all kinds of other things. Most of it's sad. Of course, we have the tragedy, the utter tragedy of the two murders in Minnesota of a former Speaker of the House and her husband, and the near murders of a state senator and his wife. And the response of some Republicans, it's beyond reprehensible.
Really?
Beyond.
I haven't heard this.
Listen to this. U.S. Senator Mike Lee. You heard of him?
Yes.
Yeah.
Utah,
Here's what he captioned. His first post. Quote, "This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way."
What?
And the second post, "Nightmare on Waltz Street." In other words, claiming this guy was a Marxist and it was Waltz's fault. Was this guy, from what we know about him, a Marxist?
This is what a senator tweeted after that
U.S. Senator, before we even knew anything.
That's crazy.
And, of course, we know this guy is a conservative Christian, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ+, a Trump supporter. The list of targets were all Democratic law
It doesn't even make any sense.
officials.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That doesn't even make any sense. Why would he think it's a Marxist?
Because their default mode is to lie and to spin. And they know that, this big chunk of their base doesn't pay attention. They don't know who he is.
Yeah, true.
So Mike Lee says he's a Marxist. Oh, yeah, it's the Marxists, the left.
Crazy.
And this is another U.S. Senator. And the U.S. Senator, Bernie Moreno from Ohio. Quote, "The degree to which the extreme left has become radical, violent, and intolerant is both stunning and terrifying."
You sure these are tweets about this? They seem so crazy.
I know.
They seem...
I had to double check them because I couldn't believe them.
They don't even make sense logically.
Right. But again, they count on people not paying attention.
I guess
And
so.
just listening to this extremist. You think they're going to take responsibility for
No,
anything?
of course not.
They're always going to blame it on the commies, the socialists, the left, the swamp. Doesn't matter that this guy's a conservative Republican, apparently, best we know.
I don't get it. That doesn't even make any sense.
I get it.
I mean, I get why they're doing it, but it's diabolical. You know what's weird? I've also noticed recently that a lot of Congress people on the right and just politicians at the right, they seem to, when they talk about LA and fires, they seem to mock all the people who got their houses burned down in the LA fires. I saw Nancy Mace doing it. I think even Trump did it.
Yeah.
They start like, what kind of world are we living in where we're mocking wildfire victims?
Musk said, and the MAGA lined up behind him. One of the biggest problems we have is empathy. We've got to combat empathy. We can't have any empathy for our fellow human beings.
That's psychotic.
Doesn't matter what happens to anyone else but us.
That's psychotic.
Yeah, and that's this again. This is all right out in the open. It's not like there's some secret cabal going on here. As you say, how can people not see? How could people not understand what this is all about?
Right.
And then again, talk about, possibly blood on the hands. I'm not making that claim, but something that's dangerous is another RFK Jr. maneuver.
Oh, not this guy.
Firing everyone on the advisory committee on immunization practices. He almost didn't get confirmed. You know who the swing vote on the Senate committee was?
I don't remember.
Senator Bill Cassidy, a physician who was very concerned, and people thought he might sink the nomination.
He should have.
Well, guess what he did? He believed what RFK Jr. told him in the nomination hearings. And what have we always said about nomination hearings? What are they worth?
Nothing.
Exactly. They're not worth the paper or the transcripts that they're written on. So Cassidy said he has committed, RFK Jr., that he would work within the current vaccine approval and safety monitoring systems and not establish parallel systems. If confirmed, he will maintain the President's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices without changes. And what did he do? He fired them all.
Oh, God.
Talk about changes. And so far, guess what we know about Kennedy said, a clean sweep is necessary to reestablish public confidence in vaccine science.
The reason why public confidence is so low is because of you, RFK Jr.
Yes.
This is what I'm so sick of these rich, powerful people doing. Same thing with the 2020 election voter fraud, when they all said, I'm just responding to my electorate who are concerned about the integrity of our elections. It's like, no, you started this misinformation around the election shit. RFK Jr., you were a big factor in starting the misinformation around vaccines. You're
Remember
the reason why there's so much
Samoa,
doubt.
When he went on a anti-vaccine.
Yeah, we've heard that many times.
So we actually have, and look, 1,200 measles cases, unprecedented in recent history. And guess who we replaced, at least so far, these 17 members with? Eminent scientists with deep experience in vaccines.
Of course not.
Of course not. People with minimal qualifications, anti-vax skeptics. He said, well, I got one guy who's at the George Washington University, I think he said. And guess what George Washington University said?
He's not.
He's not.
He's not affiliated.
He's not employed here. Here is what immunologist and epidemiologist, one of the most eminent in the country, Michael Mina, said about what he's doing. Generally speaking, experts in disease vaccines prevent experts in vaccines, infectious epidemiology, and clinical trials. If these appointees were in the private sector, no way would RFK Jr.'s group pass muster. And this is similar. Remember, he came out with this big report that cited sources that didn't exist. They called it a formatting error or misinterpreted other sources. And this, it's laughable, but it's serious.
It's not that laughable anymore.
I know. It's dead. It's dead serious is right. Our health
He's a
depends on
laughable human being, but what he's doing is not laughable.
No, what he's doing is very serious and threatens our lives and well-being.
That depressed me.
All right, I'm going to give you a positive before we get to the questions.
Okay.
A judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, who was appointed, been on the bench for 40 years, struck down a lot of the denial of NIH scientific grants that the Trump administration has done. saying he has never seen anything so blatantly discriminatory in his 40 years on the bench. Again, not some deranged liberal Marxist, a judge, conservative judge appointed by Ronald Reagan. He had never seen in 40 years on the bench something so discriminatory that, they're using this DEI as an excuse for discriminating against people on no basis other than their race, their gender, or their sexual orientation. And that is simply not permissible.
Nice.
That's a very, very important, very notable court decision. Trump is losing left and right in the courts, whether, in the end the Supreme Court will decide with him or not, we don't know. Whether or not he will fully obey court rulings, I certainly do have my doubts. In the argument about the deployment of National Guard and Marines in Los Angeles, Trump's administration is arguing the courts can't review it. It's strictly a presidential prerogative, which is indicative of their general position that the courts can't really review anything that the president does, right?
Right.
That, he's the unilateral executive, and what he does stands regardless of what another branch of government may do. All right, I've got to make one other point, and unfortunately it's another downer. Oh, the U.S. Senate has made even deeper cuts in Medicaid than the House in order to try to mitigate the big hole in the deficit, which the budget office just estimated as $2.8 trillion, even taking into account the economic effects of the tax cuts. So we can spend $45 million on a useless parade. We can spend $134 million on occupying Los Angeles. We can spend tens of millions on Trump's golf trips. We can spend tens of billions of additional monies on rounding up undocumented immigrants who, by the way, are just a recent study showed at least 90%, at least, had committed no crimes or only things like minor traffic violations. He's not getting rid of the cutthroat criminals like he claims. So we can, add billions to that, all these other millions, but we've got to cut the lifeline to the poorest and most vulnerable people in America in order to transfer more money to those who don't need it.
You depressed me again. You had me up.
I'm sorry. I had you up. And
well, I've got. We'll do some housekeeping, which is full of some good news. How about that? Before we get to
questions? Let's do the housekeeping.
If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. We've got almost 1,800 people watching, but only 600 likes. What the heck? We need to get those likes up. Remember, it's free to give a like, so don't forget to give a like. If you want to get your questions in line for this guy, Alan Lichtman, you got to donate or become a member. We are having a competition, Dad.
A competition. I love it.
It is now open, Savannah, if you want to put the link to the Google form in the chat and pin it. We are looking for the best slogan and or messaging for the Dems in 2026 and 2028. So fill out the Google form, give us your best slogan, your best acronym, your best messaging, and you can win.
Wow.
Conservative at the Core. His new book, a signed copy sent directly to your house.
Signed, yes.
What we're going to do is, after a couple of weeks, we're going to pick a top 5, and then we're going to present it on the live, put up a poll, and the winner, the people will vote, and the winner will get a signed copy of this book. I'll just flip to a random page and read it to the people. You ready?
It was very prescient last time you randomly read something.
Believing that Republicans will make good on pledges to reduce the size and scope of government makes us Charlie Brown to the politicians football-holding Lucy, noted the libertarian Reason magazine.
Wow.
Look at that.
Look at that.
I just flipped to a random page.
Yeah, this was written, 4 months ago. Before Trump, or 5 months, just right at the very beginning. And guess what? It nails it, right?
Right.
It nails exactly what's going on. So, we've been a little low on donations and members. We really need that. So if you could step up That would be awesome. And by the way, the book you're going to get is not this. This is just the galleys. It's going to be a beautiful first edition hardcover. Hardcover.
Wow. So it won't be a soft cover and it won't have this yellow.
No, of course not.
Right.
This is just the galleys.
What's the galleys mean?
It means it's the uncorrected proofs before final publication to be sent out to reviewers and commentators and things like. We got some great comments. Check out Amazon. You can see 5 or 6 really amazing comments about this book.
And the Google form to submit your Dem slogan is now pinned to the chat. So make sure you fill out that form. How many weeks do we want to give it? Like,
what's that?
How many weeks do we want to give it? Like 3 weeks?
3
maybe?
weeks is good.
Okay, so get your slogans in. And don't forget, you could be the winner of a signed copy. All right. Let's get into some questions.
Why not?
This one's from one of our moderators, Ozone.
What's a moderator?
Someone who moderates the chat while we're live.
Oh, thank you, whoever you are.
See, he doesn't even know what that is.
Yeah.
What do you think is BB's exit strategy here? He's been profusely vague or purposefully vague about their goals. And do you think he can drag the U.S. into this? And if so, how liable is Donald Trump on entering a war without congressional approval?
It's a truly profound question. Truly. No wonder you're a moderator. Of course he's being vague. You know, he wants to keep all options open. And if he's too specific about what he wants to do and doesn't achieve it, you know, then he's going to be left with egg on his face. So if you're vague about your objectives, no matter what happens, you can claim you won. It's also a typical Trump strategy, right? He never loses.
Right.
No matter what happens, he's won. So, you know, it was a fantastic, world greatest parade we've ever seen, you know. Biggest crowd ever. So he has been purposely vague. I do believe, though, and this is speculation, just my opinion, and I'm not the world's leading Middle East expert, but I know something about it. I think he wants to topple the Iranian regime. I don't think he just wants to take out their nuclear capacity. I think his goal is to destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that does... Yeah, go ahead.
He brings up an interesting point with congressional approval and
I'm going to get
war.
to that.
Oh, okay.
I haven't gotten to that.
Gotcha.
This is such a profound question.
Wow.
It requires a very lengthy answer, unfortunately.
No, that's fortunate.
So he's trying to destroy the Iranian regime. And even if he does that, it doesn't mean it's going to be a positive, Sam. You know, we took out a regime in 1953. Do you know that? We organized a coup. We toppled the Iranian regime of President Mossadegh because he was too far left. And what they got was 26 years of repression under the Shah, and then the Islamic Revolution that led to today's conundrum. So, you know, taking down a government does not mean a positive. When we took down Gaddafi, was that good for Libya, Sam?
No, they will always create these vast power vacuums whenever
right.
they do that.
Same thing in Iraq. You know, all of these various factions battling one another in a failed state. So, you know, you may have these dreams that if you took out, I think it's Ayatollah Khamenei, you'd have this wonderful pro-Western liberal regime. That's a pipe dream. Absolutely, he wants to drag the U.S. into this. He doesn't want this to be Israel alone. He wants this to have the prestige and the power of the U.S. And one thing the U.S. has is the bunker busting bomb. You know about that, Sam?
No.
So Iran's main nuclear facility, I think it's called Fordo, is like way hundreds of feet underground. And even Israel doesn't have bombs that could penetrate it. Only the U.S. and its big strata bombers, B-52s, can do it. So he wants the U.S. to come in and, you know, use the busting bomb, say that quickly.
No,
bunker busting bomb to take out the big Fordo nuclear facility. And of course he wants generally the power and prestige of the U.S. Unfortunately, Trump is unlikely to be liable for entering a war without congressional approval. You know, technically, what should happen before we enter a war? Not just congressional approval, a declaration of war.
Right.
When was the last declared war, Sam?
World War II.
World War II. So, we've had all these wars.
It's crazy.
With, minimal approval, minimal.
Iraq wasn't a declared war?
Nope.
No?
Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, none of them were declared wars.
Crazy.
So let's say most of them did get, except for Korea, congressional approval. But so what? What are they going to do? Impeach him?
No.
No, the Republicans who control Congress are going to do nothing.
Can I ask you why that keeps happening? Why do we keep getting into wars that are not technically even declared in the United States?
It's the idea of the unilateral president.
But isn't that unconstitutional?
What?
Isn't that unconstitutional?
Of course it is. But you know what? You know who fought the first unconstitutional war?
No.
Take a guess. Way back. George Washington, the war against the Indian nations.
Oh.
And the second undeclared war was Thomas Jefferson, the war against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. So undeclared wars go back to the very beginning of the Republic.
The Mediterranean? You mean the Caribbean?
The Mediterranean.
Oh, really?
Yes, these are the Barbary states of the Mediterranean area where we had... America was big on trade in those days, and American shipping went through the Mediterranean,
Gotcha.
And they were attacking ships or demanding tribute. And that war went on for like 15 years.
Crazy.
Undeclared, and I don't think he even had a resolution from Congress, like at least Lyndon Johnson or George W. Bush did. Not that a resolution from Congress has the same constitutional status as a declaration of war. In fact, it has no constitutional status.
Great.
The great question.
Yes. $5 donation from Arash Taheri. Dr. Lichtman, I'm an American Iranian. Iranians believe Trump is going to overthrow the regime. If this happens, would it be a breakthrough for Trump?
Well, we just talked about that. I do think that is Netanyahu's aim. I think Trump would very much like to see the same. And that's one thing that might drag Trump into this war.
Right. It could be a foreign policy success for him.
It depends what happens.
Right. Of course. I mean,
it's like with Iraq. In the short term, it was a success, right?
Yeah.
And in the long term, a disaster.
Right.
And do you think Trump has a plan?
Yes, of course.
To what to do if you topple the Iranian regime?
No, of course not.
Yes.
Professor, U.S. DNI Tulsi Gabbard testified to the U.S. Congress a week ago that Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons and that the Supreme Leader has not authorized such plans since 2003. Who is lying to the world? Is it the DNI and the intelligence community, or Trump and Netanyahu? What are your thoughts, sir?
How far do you think I believe Trump and Netanyahu, Sam? Yeah, exactly. You can't even make the distance small enough.
But do you trust
I have no
Tulsi?
great confidence in Tulsi Gabbard either. But this reminds me of the run-up to the Iraq War.
That's what I've heard a lot of people saying recently.
Right,
yeah.
where basically they fabricated, or at least vastly exaggerated, very dubious intelligence that Iraq had stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons and was pursuing a nuclear weapons program. In fact, Condoleezza Rice, I think it was, the national security advisor to George W. Bush, said, do we really want the next warning to be a mushroom cloud over Washington? Scare them to death. And, of course, all of that was proven to be unfounded.
But, I mean, reputable journalists and news sources are saying that Israel is hitting nuclear facilities.
Among many other things now. They've greatly expanded.
But I'm just saying, like...
Yeah.
So there are facilities that exist.
Correct.
I mean, I guess they could exist without them creating weapons from them. I don't know. I'm a little confused right now.
It's very confusing, I don't trust Tulsi Gabbard. I don't trust Trump or Netanyahu. Yeah. What might be the case is that they are engaging in whatever steps are necessary, like uranium enrichment,
right,
to make a weapon, but they haven't proceeded to the point of actually constructing a weapon. I don't know. Nobody knows.
Right. Our good friend Vacuum Tubes for Hi-Fi, they say.
Yes. This is one of our smartest people, and I love this question.
Oh, okay. They say the Christian right supports this conflict because they believe it will help lead to the second coming. Is BB being destructive due to Zionism, profit, and racism towards Arab Muslims? What about the Israel lobby and Donald Trump?
All right, I want to address the first part of this question because it's so important and so misunderstood. Why do these extreme Christian conservatives, like the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, and virtually every other strong Christian conservative, why are they so supportive of Israel, Sam? Is it because they love the Jews and want to protect the Jews from anti-Semitism? No. And you want the references and the complete analysis. It's all in my book, White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement. Do we have it here?
We got it.
We got it. It's all there. It's all there. Why do they love Israel so much? It's the opposite of trying to nurture and protect Judaism. They believe, as our very smart questioner indicates, that Israel will be the site of Armageddon, the final battle between good and evil and the return of Christ to earth. And Israel must be in control of the Jews in order for Armageddon to take place and the second coming. Now, what's going to happen to the Jews when that happens, Sam, according to this prophecy?
Probably nothing good.
They're all going to be sent to the pits of hell unless they convert to Christianity. They're all going to be sent to the pits of hell unless they convert to Christianity and accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. So it's just the opposite of trying to protect and nurture Judaism.
I wish somebody would push back on that point a little bit. I saw this video of Charlie Kirk at Cambridge giving a speech and debating students, and he's so staunchly pro-Israel. This Charlie Kirk guy is like a far-right, essentially propagandist, but nobody pushes back. It's like, okay, like you're saying, let's take this step by step backwards. You support Israel. Why? Because this, okay, what does that mean? And then eventually it will lead to this answer.
Yes.
Essentially that I support the Jews so that they can all die and all the Christians can go to heaven.
But of course, any enlightened Jew will accept Jesus Christ. It's only the unenlightened, dark side of the Jewish community that won't. And they don't deserve anything better.
Someone needs to push back on these
It's completely
Christians.
Circular, self-serving logic when you think about it. And again, it's all there in my book. It's not something I just conjured up. That book was written in 2008. It's still my favorite book, until my new one, Until Conservative at the Core, which is kind of an update and advance.
It's got pictures in it.
Oh, it's got great pictures. It's my favorite book up to this one.
I didn't realize you had a book with pictures in it.
Yeah, they're great pictures.
I'd read a portion, but we gotta get to some more questions.
Yeah, we got to move on. How much time do we have? Oh my goodness!
What time is it?
Only 7 minutes.
Oh my God!
Time flies when you're having fun.
Fun. I don't know if this was fun, but it was.
Yeah, really.
Time flies when you're tackling big issues like.
I know. I'm almost out of breath from tackling these big issues.
All right, we're almost done.
All right.
A bipartisan group of lawmakers led by Tim Kaine in the Senate and Thomas Massie in the House are introducing a war powers resolution to stop Trump from joining Israel's war with Iran. Do you support its passage?
Absolutely. There is a second branch of government, which is actually the first branch of government. Article 1, is that the presidency, Sam?
No.
No, it's the Congress. Article 2 is the president. And the framers would be rolling in their graves if they saw the way in which the modern presidents particularly Trump, have seized unilateral power. And remember, there is a War Powers Act, which, presidents have, pretty much completely ignored, and this resolution could be under that act.
Our next question is from Def Leopard Rules Rock. They say,
great name.
Would a direct conflict between the United States and Iran go as a foreign failure against Trump and the GOP? That's sort of the inverse of what we answered earlier. Would it be a breakthrough? If who
Depends,
knows?
As I've said many times, which is why I don't like speculating. The devil is always in the details, and it all depends on how it comes down. As we saw in Iraq, first it was a success, and then turned into a failure. Vietnam much more quickly turned into a failure because the casualties were so much higher, about 10 times higher.
Do you think Trump left the G7 because he knows he's out of his depth being next to, quote, real leaders?
God, you want me to speculate on Trump motives?
I think he was trying to deal with the Israeli-Iran conflict.
The only thing I can say that's consistent about Trump, everything he does is about himself.
There seems to be two subgroups of MAGA. One are Christian nationalists, devout evangelical Christians who believe they are doing God's work. But what about white nationalists who aren't necessarily religious but are still on a, quote, mission? What is their underlying common belief? Not everyone on January 6th was a self-proclaimed Christian.
Right. That's true, although the great base of MAGA is evangelical Christians. They voted something like 80% plus for Trump. Everyone else voted about 40% for Trump. So you can see the importance of conservative Christians to the MAGA movement. And even those who aren't necessarily religious still share much of the same ideology, that the greatness of America is in its pioneering stock, right, which of course is white, northern, Western European settlers, and that has been eroded and endangered by these foreign elements, by the immigrants. This goes all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is nothing new. 1798, when the great enemies were the French and the French Canadians. Then it was the Irish and the Germans and the Jews and the Mexicans, and now Africans, Latin Americans, Muslims. There's always another. There's always an enemy, and that's what they share in common.
Did the No Kings protests, which crossed the 3.5% of the population threshold, turn the social unrest? We didn't even talk about that. There was, there's massive.
I know. Oh my God!
Across the country.
Yeah, let's end on something positive. Let's end the show on something incredibly positive. Well, hardly anyone showed up for Trump's big beautiful parade. We don't know exactly how many, but probably at least 3 to 5 million on one day showed up in 2,000 locations all over the country, not just New York and L.A., but lots of small and rural communities as well, to protest Trump's idea of the president as king. It was arguably the largest single-day demonstration, Sam, in the history of the country, and it vastly overshadowed Trump's limp and pathetic parade. And it's really positive. I talked about this many, many times in the show, Sam, right? That one of the things, among others, that ordinary Americans, that every one of us can do, is to vote with our feet and get out there and protest.
I honestly thought that the military parade was kind of a slap in the face to service members. He yoinked them out of their service, pulled them all to D.C., made them march down the street in this sort of like dud of a parade. I feel like it was a slap in the face to our military.
Well, look at the soldiers or the National Guards people in L.A. sleeping on the floor of what looked like warehouses.
Right.
With not even any bedding.
All right, so we'll end on that.
End on that on a very positive note.
I want to give some...
The American people are responding. Getting out in the streets can matter. That's how, what is now the largest nation in the world, particularly if you count Pakistan and Bangladesh, got its freedom, India, from the British Empire. People getting out and voting with their feet and even taking risks. The risks of being gunned down by the authorities.
I want to give some shout-outs to some donators who didn't get on air. Lori Robinson, Sharon Novak. Who else? Adam Bryceland. Secular Monk, Limited Light.
I love that name, Secular Monk. It's
Emmanuel.
a little bit of an oxymoron.
Lori Robinson. I said that. All right, I think that's everybody that we didn't get to. All right, Dad. The good news is, if you're like, Lichtman Live is over, the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this on my channel. So stay tuned for that.
Wow, that's awesome.
All right, Dad. What are your final words to the people tonight?
You know, in the words of the immortal Bob Dylan, who was really Bobby Zimmerman. By the way, I got a great story about that. His mom, Beattie Zimmerman, used to say when Bob was a kid, "Oh, what am I going to do with Bobby? He'll never make anything of himself. All he wants to do is play with that silly guitar." You never know. And you never know here as well. And there are some very positive signs that, you know, America is fighting back. The protests that erupted all over the country, some very positive Supreme Court decisions. So don't despair. I think the times they are changing in the right direction, perhaps.
All right, Dad. Say goodnight to the people.
Good night. See you on Thursday.
And I'll see you on the Lichtman Live post show.
Well, that's just awesome.
That's just awesome.
I can't tell you how great that is.
That's just all great.
Yeah.